For today's video, I've gotten my hands on what I think is the absolute best large body-on-frame SUV available in America right now, the all-new 2021 Chevy Tahoe. If you recall, I had a previous first drive video of the Tahoe down in Southern California. I didn't have too much time with it. This video, I've had it for a week. I was hoping to get my hands on a new High Country trim, but this is the same Z71 trim of Tahoe I first drove down in Southern California. This is the off-road trim. You can see we have a more aggressive front end look, some blacked out chrome accents rather than the bright chrome, full LED headlights, and then this distinctive light strip right there that turns into the turn signal. It's actually part of the headlamp module, and then the chrome strip sort of bisects that module itself. Down at the bottom, we have some bright red tow hooks, and definitely this has a big and bold style. You can really see how tall the hood is in the Tahoe. Let's talk about competition up front. Obviously, there is the Ford Expedition. That is the big direct competitor to the Chevy Tahoe, and of course, the GMC Yukon as well. There's also the Toyota Sequoia and the Nissan Armada, but those sell in relatively smaller numbers, and they are not as modern as the Ford or the Chevy right here. You could see this as an upgrade from something like a Durango or a Ford Explorer, both of which are rear-wheel drive mid-size crossovers technically. They don't have quite the same kind of room inside, but the Durango does have a slightly higher towing ability than the Tahoe. Coming very soon, there's going to be a full-size SUV from Jeep, but that's most likely going to compete directly with the Cadillac rather than the Chevy Tahoe. It's probably going to be more expensive than this model, although there may be a Dodge version of that at some point that would be a direct competitor to this. As you'd expect out of a full-size SUV, the Tahoe is pretty big. It's 210.7 inches long. But if this isn't long enough for you, there's the Chevy Suburban at 225.7 inches long. Both of these are a little bit longer than the Ford Expedition, with the biggest difference happening between the Suburban and the Expedition Max, where the Suburban is about 4 inches longer. Chevy didn't just stretch the outside, they've also stretched the inside considerably. So the big beneficiary to the size increase in the Tahoe is legroom and cargo capacity, both of which are significantly ahead of the Toyota Sequoia or the Nissan Armada, which are a decent amount smaller than this. The Sequoia is 5 inches shorter. The big change for the Tahoe in this generation is it now has a fully independent rear suspension. And that not only improves driving dynamics, it also improves packaging. So we find more cargo room than we had in the previous generation Tahoe, not just because of the size increase, but also because of the rear suspension design. This particular model has the optional combination magnetic dampers and air ride suspension, so the height of the suspension is adjustable. A lot of folks assume that SUVs in this category, like the Expedition, or of course this Tahoe right here, are simply a half-ton pickup truck with a bigger box in the back. But that's not exactly true. There are some commonalities in design, of course, between the Silverado 1500, and the front end definitely looks like a Silverado 1500, but the suspension design and the structure of the vehicle is quite different than what we find in the Silverado, mainly because of that independent rear suspension. The rear end design is fairly restrained. We have combination LED tail lamp modules, so the turn signals and the backup lamps are incandescent still. We have a lot of practical touches back here when it comes to cargo capacity. We have a separately opening rear window. This is something that I really love, something that's disappearing across all manner of crossovers and SUVs. And in an interesting touch, the wiper for the rear window is right up here in a separate module. It doesn't actually move with the rear window itself. Under the hood, we find some pretty familiar options. It seems like General Motors spent most of the cash on redesigning the platform, but they didn't really update the engine lineup. The base engine is a 5.3-liter naturally aspirated V8, giving you 355 horsepower and 383 pound-feet of torque. That definitely comes in below what we find standard in the Ford Expedition. If you want more oomph, there is a 6.2-liter V8, but you'll only find that in the very top-end trim of Tahoe. That gives you 420 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. Both engines are mated to a 10-speed automatic transmission. Interestingly enough, that's almost the same 10-speed that we find in the Expedition, because Ford and General Motors collaborated together to develop that 10-speed auto. It's mated to both engines under the hood. If you get the 6.2-liter V8 engine and four-wheel drive, you'll get 16 miles per gallon combined. If you get the 5.3 and rear-wheel drive, you'll get 18 miles per gallon combined. But if you want a little bit more efficiency in your Tahoe, there's also the 3-liter turbo diesel available out of the Silverado lineup. This is a purpose-built truck engine. It's an inline 6, and it's one of the few engines in this segment to offer more aggressive engine braking than we find out of the competitive 6-cylinder engines in Ford and Chrysler products. That's mainly because those V6 engines were designed primarily as passenger car engines. The inline 6 that's available under this hood was designed as a truck engine to start with. That will give you 277 horsepower, 460 pound-feet of torque, and 24 miles per gallon combined. Outside of a hybrid, that's probably going to be the most efficient option for a full-size SUV in North America at the moment, but it is also going to be the slowest engine option under this hood. I found front seat comfort to be excellent for my body size, but this front seat is not as adjustable as I would like, so keep that in mind. We don't have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. This model does have 2-position memory over there on the door and a powered tilt telescopic steering column that is memory linked. We have a front passenger seat with the same range of motion as the driver's seat. But it is worth noting that there are a number of options that are going to be smaller than this or similarly sized than this that would have a more adjustable passenger seat or driver's seat. Obviously, you will find a more comfortable seat in something like the Cadillac Escalade, but that's going to be a lot more expensive than this. When you first get inside the Tahoe, you'll really notice how much bigger this feels than the outgoing model. I have a significant amount of legroom. The front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I can actually fit back there in the third row, and I still have about 10 inches of legroom left. This is available as either a 7 or an 8 passenger vehicle, so that's another reason that you might want to upgrade from something like the Explorer or Durango into a full-size SUV. You get 1 extra seat. This particular model is the 7-passenger version, so we have 2 seats up front, 2 seats here in the middle, and then 3 in the way back. Even with this front seat fully back in its tracks, I still have about 4 inches of legroom left. The second row seats also have a pretty decent recline to them, and they slide forward and backwards so you can apportion space a little bit more equitably between the front, second, and third rows. Headroom is also very, very generous thanks to the very upright profile. This model does not have a moonroof, but even still, I have about 2 inches of headroom left. If you get the 7-passenger version, getting into the third row is pretty easy. You can just go right here through the middle of the second row captain's chairs. If we try and slide this seat forward, you'll notice that there isn't enough room right back here to get in there if you had a child seat latched into place. Now, that is a consideration for some folks out there. Let's show you how you get into the third row. This is one of those traditional fold forward and then tumble style second row seats. That's how you'd get into the third row. Clearly, you couldn't leave a child seat in place and still move the seat in that manner. Hopping into the third row, the first thing you'll notice is how much wider this third row seat is than smaller crossovers. So if you've never been inside a Tahoe or a Suburban and you're used to something like a Toyota Highlander with its 3-person third row, this is significantly wider and more comfortable. I still wouldn't call it suitable for 3 adults, although it could definitely happen if you needed it to, because again, the bench is significantly wider. But there is a ton of legroom back here. Sliding all the way over to the right side, this second row seat is all the way back in its tracks, and I have about 1 inch of legroom left. You could get even more legroom if you opted for the Suburban, or of course you could apportion the space a little bit more equitably between the 3 rows. That's definitely something that's pretty easy to do. If you're debating between the Suburban and the Ford Expedition Max, then you should keep in mind that the Expedition Max has the same amount of legroom, but it has improved cargo room behind. So all the stretch happens right back there in the cargo area. The Suburban splits a little bit between the third row and the cargo area, so not only do we get a bigger cargo area, we also get a little bit more legroom in the third row. Anyway you slice it, headroom is very generous back here. If you want a little bit more room than this or more comfortable third row seats, you're going to have to get a minivan. I have about 1.5 inches of headroom left back here, and the seat bottom cushion is not absolutely slammed to the ground. Behind the power hatch, we find 25.4 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That's behind the third row. Obviously, you'd get even more if you had the third row seats folded, and yet more if you had the second row seats folded. This is an enormous cargo area compared to any of the direct competition, except of course the larger Expedition Max and the Suburban itself. Speaking of the Suburban, you'll find 41.5 cubic feet of storage space behind the third row in that model. Up until the new generation Suburban happened, you really couldn't get 7 people in a vehicle and have a huge amount of cargo outside of a minivan, but now we have 2 full-size SUV options here. A really nice touch that is somewhat minivan-like is that the width between the wheel wells on the inside is over 48 inches, and that means that you could fit 4x8 sheet goods of things inside the Tahoe or the Suburban if you needed to. That's a dimension that's pretty unique to full-size SUVs, so you don't find that kind of width in the back of a Ford Explorer or a Dodge Durango. Lifting up the load floor, we find a very small amount of additional storage space. This area is pretty shallow, but you could put something that was about 2 inches deep there. On the right side of the cargo area, we find the controls for the power folding third row seats, also the power releases for the second row seats, and a 120-volt inverter outlet. A practical design improvement for this generation is how much flatter the second row seats fold. You can see that they're level with the third row, which is almost level with the cargo area in the back. There's a very slight bump up right here, but then the second row seats are completely level. So you could put some of those larger items in here and have essentially a flat load floor. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in a Z71 trim, so this is not a fully loaded Tahoe. We don't have things like the moonroof that would go right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. But we do have height adjustable shoulder belts, adjustable headrests, and a rear seat entertainment system in this particular vehicle. This model's seats are upholstered in leather. We don't have any perforations in the seat back or seat bottom cushion, but these seats are heated. If we move on over to the front door panels, you'll see the color combination going on in this interior. It's a dark brown, that's the headliner, the upper portion of the door is the dashboard, they're all that sort of chestnutty brown there. And then the bottom part of the door panels and the leather upholstery are sort of a gray, but they're on the brown side of the gray spectrum, if that makes sense. So a lot of soft touch materials going on the front doors, but we do find some hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door for increased durability. It's also where we find the Bose speakers. This does have that optional sound system. Moving up to the top of the door, we find some very believable imitation wood trim right there on the doors. If you want to find better trim, obviously they're going to be more expensive versions of the vehicles in the GM lineups. You can move over to something like the Denali or all the way up to the Cadillac Escalade if you want the most premium interior. That trim moves over to the dashboard where again we find a large portion of soft touch materials. We find a little storage cubby on this side, which is kind of an intriguing touch. I'm not quite sure what you'd put in that little storage area, but it is about 6 inches deep. So some smaller smartphones might fit in there, but larger smartphones definitely won't. Again, some of that stitching over here on the dashboard, hard plastics lower. We pop open that glove compartment, we find a slightly larger compartment than we found in the last Tahoe. I was barely able to fit a 10-inch iPad inside. In the middle of the dashboard, we have a large touchscreen infotainment system. This supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. It also supports wireless smartphone integration, although at the moment my phone is connected wired via the USB port. Over here on this side, we have the Hunt and Peck style shifter. Park is a button. Reverse is a pull. You actually pull that back like that to engage reverse. Neutral is a button. Drive is a pull. We then have low as a button, and then you toggle around through the gears using the plus and minus button. I don't mind the rest of the shifter design, but if I was towing a trailer, this I do find annoying. I really wish it just had paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. We find 2 large air vents right there under that infotainment display, and the controls for the climate control system, also some physical buttons for the infotainment system right there. You see the heated seat controls down there. Button for the rear climate, you can turn it on and off or use the screen to control that rear climate zone. USB-C and USB input, 12-volt charge port, Qi wireless charging mat right there, 2 very, very large cup holders, and then a rubbery area right here in the center console area where you can put a smartphone. Some of those larger smartphones like this iPhone 12 Max, that just won't fit quite right there. If I open this up, however, we do have a very large storage area, almost as big as we find in the Chevy Silverado line, but you'll notice it's not as deep. So you'd be able to put hanging files in a pickup truck, but in here, you can just put something like a small tablet computer inside. On the driver's side, we find an instrument cluster that should be pretty familiar if you've seen any of GM's truck line before. We have a large LCD in the middle, and then physical gauge for the speedometer and tachometer. There's a row of auxiliary gauges at the top, and then the rest of the display is configurable. You can choose things like turn-by-turn navigation directions, infotainment readouts, trip computer readouts. You can adjust certain settings for that display. You can see your trip computer, things like that. The top of the display is used primarily for the auxiliary gauges. The bottom of the display can be used for things like this home screen that gives you the readout from the car's sign recognition. Also your digital speedometer. We have trip computer information, turn-by-turn navigation directions, the status of the vehicle's active safety systems, infotainment readouts, tire pressure monitoring, all that sort of stuff going on in here. The steering wheel is also pretty similar to the Silverado pickup truck line. We don't have any sport grips up top. This is a 4-spoke design. We have controls for the cruise control over here on the left side, also a steering wheel heat button over there, controls for that multifunction instrument cluster over here on the right. You'll find the volume and track up-down buttons on the back of the steering wheel. We have volume up-down on the right, and then track up-down on the left. To the left of the steering wheel, we find a ton of additional buttons. This is also where we find the integrated trailer brake controller. It's hidden right there behind the steering wheel. We get our dimmer, headlight controls. These controls not only control the 4-wheel drive system, we have auto, 4-high, 4-low, etc., but this toggle is the sport mode toggle, so you can choose between sport, off-road, tow haul, or normal, and then if we press this little button at the bottom, the toggle becomes the adjustment for the adaptive air suspension, so you can adjust the ride height there. We then have the lane centering, stability and traction control, parking sensors, hill descent control, all that jazz going on there. I really wish that GM would either update the 5.3-liter V8 or they would make the 6.2-liter V8 available in different packages on the Tahoe rather than simply the top-end version. Because 0 to 60 time in this model is definitely behind what we see in the most direct competitor, which would be the Ford Expedition. In this model, I ran 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds. That's versus 6.1 seconds in the last Expedition that I tested. That's because in the Ford Expedition, the twin-turbo 3.5-liter V6 is standard, not optional. Meanwhile, in the Tahoe, if you want to get that level of performance, you're going to have to opt for the most expensive trim of Tahoe. It's also worth noting that if you're going to try and compare this to something like a Dodge Durango, again, it's not quite the same kind of vehicle, But if you were to make that comparison for the same price that you pay for this model with this level of performance, you would get a significantly faster Durango. You could get something like the 6.4 liter over 400 horsepower Durango. It's definitely going to be faster 0 to 60 than the model that I'm driving here. 60 to 0 stopping distance is definitely improved over the last Tahoe that I drove. This model stopped in 127 feet. You can thank the wide tires and the overall design of the Tahoe for that short stopping distance. Although this transmission is essentially the same design as the one that we find in the Ford Expedition, I like the way that General Motors has programmed the software a little bit better than Ford. This transmission seems to find the right gear a little bit faster than the transmission that we find in the Ford Expedition. And coupled with the naturally aspirated V8 engine, I like the torque delivery a little bit better too. There's no turbo lag like we find in the Expedition. Again, 0 to 60 time and passing times are actually going to be slower in this model, but I think it has a good feel to it. And of course, GM's V8 engines sound excellent. So if you want that traditional classic V8 sound rather than a digital soundtrack that we find in a lot of modern Ford products, then you might want to take a look at this. But the most impressive thing about the Tahoe really is the suspension design. When I first heard that the Tahoe was getting a combination of a magnetic damper and an air suspension, I was a little bit doubtful that the two would really play together as well as they do. But this is excellent, absolutely excellent. This has the best ride and I think the best quality of suspension tune that you'll find in a full-size SUV. That's not to say that the Tahoe drives ostensibly small, because this is definitely big and heavy out on the road. So if you're taking a look at any crossover out there, or something like a Ford Explorer or a Dodge Durango, those are definitely going to be nimbler out on the road. Even the Dodge Durango, which can feel a little bit heavy at times, is going to be more nimble than the Tahoe. But compare this against the Sequoia or the Armada or an Infiniti QX80 or something like the Ford Expedition, and I think this suspension is perfection. I'm really impressed with the air ride suspension in this model. I was able to drive a model with the steel spring suspension and it definitely has a good tune to it, but I think that this air suspension and MagneRide combo is worth every penny. And if I were shopping for a Tahoe, this is exactly the suspension that I would get. When it comes to overall handling, because an option like the Dodge Durango could be included sort of in this segment, I'm going to give this an A when it comes to handling rather than an A+. But I certainly think that the handling scores of all of the other full-size SUVs has to drop below what we see here in the Tahoe. Even though I really wish we had an engine update under the hood, I think that GM made the right decision to instead focus a lot of the cash on redesigning the rear suspension in the Tahoe. This doesn't get upset over broken pavement, and it has a very car-like demeanor, even though this is a body-on-frame big SUV. The air suspension also really delivers excellent ride quality, so ride quality is certainly going to be an A+ in this model. And we get the benefit of having the adaptive height functionality, so if you want to increase your ride height, you can do that. You can also lower the Tahoe down to make it easier to get in and out or load cargo in the back. That's something that's pretty critical in a big body-on-frame SUV like this because it is quite high off the ground. Cabin noise is also very well controlled in this Tahoe. I recorded 69 decibels at 50 miles an hour, easily making this the quietest entry in the mainstream segment. If you want a quieter vehicle than this, you're going to have to buy a luxury vehicle. In a logical world, the Suburban might be a little bit louder because it has a larger cargo area in the back, and that may allow a little bit more road noise to come into the cabin, but it's probably going to be just about as quiet as the Tahoe that I'm driving here. The one obvious downside to a large SUV like this is fuel economy, and you will find better real-world fuel economy in something like the Ford Expedition or something like the Dodge Durango. But this is going to be notably better than the Toyota or the Nissan full-size SUVs. The Sequoia and the Armada have been really disappointing when it comes to the overall fuel economy. They have older engine and older transmission designs, and that really hurts them when it comes to fuel economy. Although the 5.3-liter V8 under this hood isn't exactly a spring chicken, it does have a lot of GM's fuel-saving tech, and it has the newer 10-speed automatic transmission. That's why over a week of mixed driving in this model, I've been averaging about 15.5 miles per gallon. That's not exactly great. I do wish it was better, but it is significantly better than the Sequoia or the Armada in the same driving cycles. Unfortunately, due to a variety of factors this week, I haven't been able to drive this on my usual fuel economy test loop. So this is just regular driving from the office to home, from home to the office. And remember, that does involve going up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass. So in steady state highway travel, you'll definitely be getting better fuel economy. And fuel economy in steady state highway travel definitely has been an asset for this 5.3-liter V8, whether we're talking about it in this vehicle or in the Silverado pickup line. Bottom line, the new suspension in the Tahoe is not just the first thing you're going to notice, but it's also the thing that makes this Tahoe the segment leader, in my opinion. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the pricing section, but quite simply, the Tahoe is the best to drive in this segment. And this is by far the best Tahoe that has ever existed. I have to say that I really hope that some of the suspension improvements that we see in this work their way into the GM pickup truck line at some point in time. I know a lot of folks wouldn't really be interested in a fully independent rear suspension in a pickup truck, but I would be really intrigued to see what GM could do as far as giving us a durable half-ton pickup truck, perhaps in a lower trim level that has more of an on-road tuned suspension like this. I think that could be the ultimate street drive pickup truck. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. I would also love to see a combination of this Magna Ride and adaptive air suspension worked into the Silverado pickup truck line. That really could be another game changer. As far as feature content goes, the Tahoe and Suburban trim levels are virtually identical, except you get the more room in the Suburban, a little bit less room in the Tahoe. Tahoe is going to be a lot easier to park, however. The Suburban is one of the longest new vehicles you can buy that's not a pickup truck in the US. Bearing in mind that full-size SUVs are certainly more expensive than mid-size crossovers, and in many ways more expensive than the half-ton trucks that theoretically they are at least somewhat related to. So you could certainly get into something like a Chevy Silverado for less than a Chevy Tahoe, although the interior in the Silverado is definitely not as premium as the one that we find in the Tahoe. If you work yourself all the way up to the high country version of the Suburban, that's going to start at $76,185. The Tahoe is going to be a little bit less expensive, but again, very similar feature content. If you're thinking that $70,000 to $80,000 is a bit too much to spend on a vehicle with a mainstream logo on the front, keep in mind that the Lincoln Navigator starts around $75,000 or so, and the Cadillac Escalade is significantly more expensive than the Tahoe or the Suburban. With that out of the way, let's dive right into the competition. Let's talk about the Toyota Sequoia first. This is one of the older entries in the segment. It got a recent refresh, but it was very, very minor. The Toyota is similarly expensive. It's going to start at $50,100 for the SR5 trim, although it doesn't get as expensive as top-end trims of the Tahoe. That's logical because we don't find the same kind of feature content available in the Toyota that we do find in the Chevy. We don't find a long version of the Sequoia. There's just one size fits all. And we don't have modern engines or transmissions in the Sequoia either. That's my biggest complaint about this model. 15 miles per gallon is pretty much an ouch, and that's for the two-wheel drive version. If you get the four-wheel drive version of the Sequoia, you're going to be expecting 14 miles per gallon combined. That is significantly less efficient than any version of the Tahoe. That's because the engine under the hood is still a relatively old 5.7-liter V8 engine. It produces 381 horsepower, which is pretty peppy, but it's connected to an older 6-speed automatic transmission. It's really no wonder that the Chevy Tahoe outsells the Toyota Sequoia by about 12 to 1. The main claim to fame for the Toyota is reliability. The Sequoia is pretty reliable, but when you think about this a little bit more critically, you'll end up spending so much more on gasoline over the course of, say, 10 years versus something like a base version of the Chevy Tahoe, that any savings based on reliability or predicted reliability problems is completely washed out by the extra fuel that you will be using. Over the course of 10 years and say 100 to 150,000 miles, we're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars worth of extra fuel burnt in that Sequoia. Similar things happen when we take a look at the Nissan Armada. The Armada has a slightly newer engine and transmission design, but it's not that much more efficient than what we see in the Toyota. And the basis of the Nissan Armada dates back to about 11 years at this point. The Armada is the Nissan Patrol. It was first launched in other world markets as the Nissan Patrol, then Infiniti took it over as the QX. At that point in time, the Armada was based on a different vehicle, but they decided to harmonize things together worldwide and not redesign the product. So even though the Armada in this generation has not been sold as an Armada in the United States for that long, the basis of the vehicle isn't exactly young. It has a 400 horsepower 5.6-liter V8 engine under the hood, so more power than we find standard in the Tahoe or in the Toyota. It's mated to a 7-speed automatic transmission, which is a little bit more modern, but not quite where we see the new 10-speed automatic transmission in the Chevy and in the Ford lineup. Although not to the same level as the Sequoia, the Armada also has a well-deserved reputation for being bulletproof. This is the kind of vehicle that you find crossing sand dunes in the Middle East, crossing across deserts in Australia, etc. Worldwide, the Nissan Patrol has a very Land Cruiser-like reputation. It also has a high standard towing ability of 8,500 pounds, but there is that low fuel economy again. Quite logically, and when you take a look at the sales charts, this really is a two-way race, so let's dive into the main competitor, the Ford Expedition. Ford bundles all sales of the Expedition together. That's Expedition and Expedition Max, the long wheelbase version. If you take a look at the similar picture over at General Motors, the Tahoe and Suburban outsell the Expedition lineup by about 50%. If you start tossing in the Yukon lineup, which is essentially the GMC version of the Tahoe, then that's nearly 2 to 1. I think part of that is because there is more variation available in the General Motors lineup. If you don't like the Chevy front end, you can get the GMC front end. I think the GMC Denali's interior is also a little bit nicer than what we see in the Chevy interior. There's a different dashboard available basically in that GMC Yukon as well, if that's something that you're interested in. In terms of interior design, I think that GM is currently in the lead. I liked the interior of the Expedition a little bit more when it first launched, but now Chevy has definitely leapfrogged Ford in terms of the interior design. It does not get the new interior from the new F-150. That may come at some later date, but at the moment, it's basically the interior of the older F-150 that's been SUV-ified to fit in with the Expedition name. The Expedition's also a little bit more expensive. That's probably part of the reason that it doesn't sell quite as well. $52,810 for the base version, $55,835 for the Max. I don't have 2021 pricing just yet, so those are 2020 prices. There's just one engine on offer in the Expedition. It's the Ford 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6. It produces a decent amount of power, though, 400 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. That's one of the highest torque and power levels standard in this segment. As a result, we have pretty high towing abilities. If you want to tow a great deal of weight and you don't want a pickup truck, the Expedition is probably the best option out there, with a tow rating of 9,300 pounds when properly equipped. When Ford first put an independent rear suspension in the Expedition, it really redefined how large SUVs drove, because it no longer drives like a pickup truck. Same thing that we see in the Chevy Tahoe. It certainly drives like a big, heavy SUV, but it doesn't quite have that pickup truck-like ride in the rear end. It is much more civilized, and that's exactly why GM went in that direction with the Tahoe and Suburban. Of course, GM and Tahoe pushed the envelope a little bit. It is a newer design, so I think that the on-road driving dynamics in the Tahoe and Suburban are a little bit better than what we find in the Ford, but the Ford is certainly a next step above what we see in the Toyota and the Nissan. If I were choosing between these two vehicles at the moment, I would certainly get the Tahoe or Suburban. I also love the way the GMC product line looks, so definitely keep those in mind as well. I think that they come across as a little bit more refined. I love the adaptive suspension, and the adaptive suspension combined with the airlift suspension. That really is a new feature in this segment. And if you're looking for the best riding large SUV, quite simply, that's going to be the best option. But I also like GM's engine lineup better than the twin-turbo V6 that we find in the Expedition. Fuel economy is actually pretty similar, but the V8 engine sounds a little bit better, and when towing, I like the way that it feels out on the road just a little bit better than we find in the Expedition. Now, the Expedition is going to give you higher towing ratings because we do get more torque out of that twin-turbo V6, but the complete package together, if you're going to tow about 7,000 pounds or so, I would probably just get the V8 in the Tahoe or in the Suburban. That 6.2-liter V8 is available. That's going to give you more horsepower than we find in the Expedition, but not quite as much torque. And of course, the torque curve is going to be a little bit different in a naturally aspirated V8 versus a twin-turbo 6 like we find in the Ford. In a rational world, that's basically it for competition for these full-size SUVs. You could look at these as an upgrade from something like a Durango or an Explorer. The Dodge Durango will actually tow more than the Chevy Tahoe, but it's just not the same thing. Neither is the Ford Explorer. The only real thing that they have in common is that they're all rear-wheel drive. The Durango is an excellent tow vehicle, but it's just not the same thing. It doesn't have the same kind of seating capacity, the same kind of interior room. The interior in the Tahoe and Suburban is absolutely cavernous, and the cargo area is enormous if you get that Suburban. So it's just not the same kind of beast. Bottom line, if you're shopping for a full-size SUV in America, you should definitely put the Chevy on your shopping list. And I would say also put the GMC on your shopping list because I think I prefer its front-end design just a little bit more than what we see in the Tahoe. Let me know what you think about all that in the comments section. Be sure and find me over at facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what I'm driving this week, Instagram, all those other social places. And of course, you can check out the merch store at aoamerch.com so you can buy shirts right like this one. I'll see all of you later.